There were specific people within the House at the time who did come into Downing Street to settle scores or to push agendas.
You're very generous to Boris Johnson himself in the way you talk about him, really, and you're pushing it all on SPADs. But the SPADs are appointed by Boris Johnson, aren't
they?
Do you not see that all advisors, especially people who have power, are there for a reason? It wouldn't have come as a surprise to him, would it? That these people hold these views and are trying to push a particular agenda.
Yeah, and I think on reflection, I can't speak for him, but I would say that if he had the opportunity to do it again, which I'm sure he probably wishes he does, he wouldn't pick the team that he picked. He didn't pick a team of folks who were all trying to fight for him. He brought in many people with their own agenda, and then the outcome was pretty much inevitable.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is Samuel Kasumu. Now, Samuel was special advisor to Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister between 2019 and April 2021, when he resigned. Now, his brief was called Civil Society and Communities, but he was widely referred to as Boris Johnson's racism advisor. And he left Downing Street not long after the government's own racism report, which was very controversial. But Samuel's written a book called The Power of the Outsider, in which he addresses the reasons why he left and what he learned along the way. He has been he's entered sort of active politics since leaving Downing Street and wanted to be the Conservative candidate for the Mayor of London, but he didn't succeed in winning that nomination and is now sort of touring the book. And what else are you doing?
I run a business and I'm a district councillor and I'm busy doing other things.
So you're very busy?
Yeah.
Tell me why you were an outsider in Downing Street.
For many reasons. So when I arrived in 2019, I was one of the very few people that hadn't worked with Boris Johnson when he was at City Hall as Mayor of London or when he ran the Vote Leave campaign, and neither was I a legacy hire. So I guess in many of those respects, I was an outsider, but I was also an outsider because I was one of very few people in the team I was part of that didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, was from a working class background, grew up in social housing. So I wasn't very typical in terms of the types of people that would enter in Downing Street as a special advisor.
So how did you become an insider?
Am I an insider?
Well, once you're working in Downing Street, you're an insider, aren't you? So how did you get inside, I suppose, is what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a job you apply for, of course. So somebody has to, usually the Prime Minister thinks it's a good idea for you to come and join their team. And so under Theresa May, she had set up the Race Disparity Unit, and the Race Disparity Advisory Board was there to oversee the unit and, looking at all the data that helped to highlight some of the discrepancies around outcomes for certain ethnic groups. And I was one of the people that was on the founding advisory board. And so when she left, I was asked to come in and serve in Boris's team full time.
So he sort of inherited you and promoted you?
You could say that.
I mean, did you have a personal relationship with him at all?
I'd known him. We weren't close, but I knew who he was, yes.
So who were your champions? I mean, how did you... how do you go from that, from working, being one of many people working under the previous administration to what could have been a very powerful position within Downing Street?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very powerful position. I suppose the answer to that is there aren't many people that could do that specific job where there was a vacancy once Boris went in. So it wasn't because I was particularly special.
Did you have a particular champion? Was there somebody?
Well, there were people there that would vouch for me. Claire Watson was one who knew me, and there were a few others who are probably not very well known to the public. There are also some members of Parliament now, like Daddy Kruger, etc.
And so, what was your job?
So because
we were never very clear, sort of.
Yeah. As you say, most people refer to me as the Prime Minister's race advisor. It was slightly broader than that. So the civil society unit that I led focused on, I guess, repairing or building the relationship between the government and civil society organisations. And then the second part was engaging with communities, being that link between number 10 departments and communities to be able to understand the intelligence that you need to be able to deliver on specific policy priorities. So, for example, the response to the Windrush scandal It was something I inherited. Also, the mental health white paper, because we have huge levels of disproportionality in terms of outcomes. I was responsible for getting that published with Matt Hancock. During the pandemic, the disproportionality around the impact was something I was leading on very, very much. And the last thing I helped to lead on before I left was vaccine deployment, because of course, yes, everybody could have access to the vaccine, but not every community was keen to take it up. And that was not just along the lines of ethnic background. There are also socioeconomic variances and also regional versus rural, etc. And so my job essentially was to try to understand how we could plug gaps and how we could make sure that the government was trying to serve all parts of society, and we're considering some factors when we're making policy decisions.
So going into this very Eton and Oxbridge, Downing Street, as it was, for the sort of clever white men who sort of thought they ruled the world. What was it like being an outsider? Being a sort of a working class black guy.
To be honest with you, your prime minister arrived, and I arrived shortly after. And as soon as you go into a place like that, there is no time to reflect or think about the fact that you might be different or you are different. The first thing you think about is, firstly, how do I avoid getting lost in this building very regularly? And the second thing is, how am I going to make an impact? How do I make sure I don't get lost in here? And so, we went in, we were dealing with Brexit, election. I went on holiday, we came back, we were in the middle of a pandemic, and then did the vaccines, and in the middle of that, some other big policy items. And then
so you never noticed how people were treating you? Or
there was no time to really reflect on that. There were probably like moments when I was reminded that I was different, but they were far and few between. So, for example, I was part of the team that was helping to craft the manifesto for the 2019 election. I remember we had a dinner one of the evenings, and then someone decided to convene a conversation about the fact that he and I were the only ones in the room that didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. And so that was a reminder that, hold on a second, yeah, you are very different. But to be honest, there weren't that many moments where there was time to really reflect. But when I left, that is when I really wanted to really understand what my experience was. And
but so on reflection, how do you feel you were treated? Not just as someone who didn't go to Oxford and Cambridge, but as a young black man.
I didn't.
Who didn't have a posh background.
Yeah, I don't think I was treated differently to my colleagues, but I do think that my perspectives were different. And so there were times when perhaps I could use that difference to push an agenda or to make sure certain voices were being heard.
And do you think people respected that difference?
Yeah.
They listened to it rather than...
They weren't, if you're in a place like Downing Street, there are 40 odd special advisors. There aren't that many of you. And so, as long as you're confident about the things that you bring to the table, then your voice, certainly with the Prime Minister, will be heard.
And how often would you meet the Prime Minister as his special advisor?
It varies. And so in terms of how the team is divided, you've got private office, and they're folks that hang around the Prime Minister pretty much every day. But you will engage with the Prime Minister if the policy item or agenda that is relevant at the time is one you look after. And so, for example, if we're dealing with Home Office reform, then yes, I would engage with the Prime Minister. Right now, with all the stuff that's happening around, migration, etc., I would have had a lot of face time. But if it's another subject, I don't know, defence, and if that's what's high on the agenda at the time, then of course there's no need for you to engage with the PM.
When you look back on your time, I mean, and you see the way Boris Johnson is written up or talked about, do you think he's fairly assessed? Is there anything you would tell us about Boris Johnson that we don't know?
I think most people's opinion of the Prime Minister, whether that's slightly positive or negative, is broadly accurate. I think he's someone that...
what you see is what you get.
Yeah, exactly. And my thing is actually, it's there is no such thing as a perfect Prime Minister, but what determines whether they're successful or not, in my opinion, is the people that they have around them helping to push whatever their agenda is. And I think that's where even Boris Johnson would attest was the key to his demise.
Right. I mean, because there was much was said about why you ended up leaving, and you sort of you tried to leave, or you considered leaving before you actually left.
Yep.
And your resignation letter was public before you even left.
Mm-hmm.
And it was widely thought that you were very uncomfortable with sort of the culture wars and the sense of division that was going on in Downing Street? I mean, is that basically what happened?
I think I left for a number of factors, but yes, in terms of this so-called culture war, it was not. It isn't something I'm very comfortable with. I don't think it's the right way for people in positions of leadership to push agendas or to deal with people they don't agree with, or to seek out political gain. I just think that's just wrong and immoral.
And did it come as a surprise to you that was what was happening?
Well, I think the tension when I was in Downing Street was that, the Prime Minister, for all of his faults, wasn't keen for his legacy to be one focused on culture wars. And also actually some of my more prominent former colleagues who have their own faults, the likes of Dominic Cummings, etc., they too were not interested in fighting culture wars.
So who was?
There were specific people. As I say, it's 40 odd of you. There were specific people within the House at the time who did come into Downing Street to settle scores or to push agendas that they were passionate about, and I felt that there was another way. And of course,
who were they?
I'm not going to name names, but
Really? Why not?
Because that's for them to defend, and I'm here to talk about myself. But what I would say is when I was in Downing Street, there were tensions because it wasn't always because I necessarily agreed or disagreed with a particular position that they took, but the way that they chose to engage with the public, I felt was not necessarily conducive for trying to create a country that is cohesive where people can get along.
But if it wasn't the Prime Minister and it wasn't Dominic Cummings, who many people regard as the real Prime Minister at that time now, how do these sort of advisors get the power to determine the national conversation? It must be more than advisors.
Well, advisors are incredibly powerful, rightly or wrongly, individuals. And if you just think about it, no policy is approved from any department without a special advisor saying they're content. Sometimes the Prime Minister will have sight of that. Very often they won't. No speech is given by any minister across government unless a special advisor has looked over it and said that they're content. One of the reasons why Silvia Braverman is no longer Home Secretary is because, of course, he did something that is not done. A special advisor at the very least would have looked at an article before it goes out. And so you have these people who are unelected, if they're doing their job right, probably largely unknown, who hold a lot of power. And so if they have scores that they want to settle.
Are you saying the culture war was being driven by advisors or by politicians like Suella Braverman?
I'd say, Suella, not at the time when I was there, but I'd say, advisors were playing a part. Certainly. I mean, yes, some ministers would agree with some of the positions being taken, but very much this agenda when I was there was being pushed by special advisors. And so the tension there was never me and the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. As I say, for all his faults, every time I'd come to him with a particular position, I cannot remember one occasion where he ever said, well, no, Samuel, that's not correct, or I don't want to do that. He was not the problem. And this is part of the reason why he didn't want me to leave when I did.
And so what aspects of culture war and division most disturbed you?
If we think back to where we were when I left, we were on our way out of the pandemic because of the vaccine deployment. But also we had experienced things like the death of George Floyd, where there were many people who had decided to come out and protest because of this strength of feeling. And I felt like we needed to find a better way to engage groups of people who bluntly I had or have an affinity with because of my own background.
The government was attacking protesters, wasn't it? Criticizing.
Yeah, and I felt like that wasn't necessarily the best way. And again, when you say the government,
Priti Patel.
Well, I can't remember, but certainly I worked for the Prime Minister at the time, and he wasn't. And so there was a need, in my opinion, for us to get to a point where we were trying to reach out and to better understand groups that perhaps some of my colleagues didn't agree with.
Well, what do you think was the aim then of people who were pushing this as a political, was it a political strategy or was it a political aim? Was it a strategy to retain power by exploiting divisions, or was it actually an aim in itself because that was the kind of world they wanted?
I think it's a bit of both. And it depends. We live in a democracy where we have elections every so often. And so for some, when you do the maths and you say, well, actually, if we push a particular agenda, we're going to be able to get the votes that we need to get us over the line. That's certainly the position for some people. And for others, it is genuinely the positions that they believe in and the causes that they're fighting for. It's very dangerous when you have people that are quite dogmatic entering into positions where they are extremely powerful, because sometimes they lose sight of the things that are more important. And so that's essentially what to a large extent happened when I was there. And it's not the first time, I'm sure it won't be the last time, but it's always a dangerous thing.
I mean, you're very generous to Boris Johnson himself in the way you talk about him, really, and you're pushing it all on SPADs. But the SPADs are appointed by Boris Johnson, aren't
they?
He's so, I mean, he owns what they are his attack dogs, aren't they?
He's prime minister, or was prime minister, and so ultimately, when you're prime minister, you're ultimately responsible for everything that happens on your watch.
But there's a reason. That is what I mean. There's a reason why he appoints people like that. It's because he wants them to do what they're doing.
I can't speak for him. I can only speak for my engagement with him. And so, as I say, like ultimately, the responsibility lies with whoever the prime minister is.
But do you not see that that all advisors, especially people who have power, are there for a reason? It's not, it wouldn't have come as a surprise to him, would it? that these people hold these views and are trying to push a particular agenda.
Yeah, and I think on reflection, I can't speak for him, but from my engagement with him, and I would say that if he had the opportunity to do it again, which I'm sure he probably wishes he does, he wouldn't pick the team that he picked. He didn't pick a team of folks who were all trying to fight for him. He brought in many people with their own agenda. And then the outcome was pretty much inevitable.
And do you see that still playing out now with the way this government's behaving? Because I mean, the cultural war hasn't gone away. People thought it might go away with Rishi Sunak, but in all sorts of ways, particularly around migration and all sorts of things, it's still very much current, isn't it?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, I would say that Rishi Sunak's administration is more coherent in terms of the people that are working for him. They're all pulling in the same direction. I'm not saying I completely agree with it. In fact, I don't, to a large extent. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's completely vanished. I think there are some people who are more mature taking positions. I think James Cleverly is certainly an upgrade on Suella Braverman, and some of the things he's been saying so far around how he's responding to the immigration question, whether people agree with the policy decisions he's taken, they're still focused on policy and not rhetoric and not trying to divide. And so I think it is okay for people not to agree with policy positions. That's completely fine. But when you exploit people's fears in order to seek political advantage, I think that is very immoral.
Is that what you think Suella Braverman was doing?
I think it'd be generous for me to think that it was all calculated, but I think her actions would have or have led to that outcome. So I don't know if she's doing it on purpose, but certainly her rhetoric was very uncomfortable for me and just wrong.
Give me an example.
I mean, I think that the way that she has responded to British Muslims, for example, it's totally inappropriate when she made a statement about Pakistani men. All of the evidence, Home Office evidence, both public evidence and evidence delivered in private, pointed to the fact that you could not say that there was an explicit disproportionality around the amount of Pakistani men involved in obviously the evil act of grooming young girls. But nonetheless, he still chose to use that. Obviously, we have huge challenges in the Middle East. And again, I think that a lot of our rhetoric hasn't been focused on trying to bring communities together.
Do you find it surprising that is her rhetoric, given her own ethnicity?
I think people...
Because a lot of people do, don't they? But I mean...
I think people respond to things based on a number of variables. I don't know too much about her upbringing, so I can't really comment on why she is manifesting the things she's been manifesting in the way that she has done. But everybody's story is different. When people meet me, they think, well, someone you used to work for a prime minister and you've done all these other things. Surely you must have gone to Eton and come from privilege. So there's always an assumption when you look at people, but I don't know her story, so I couldn't comment on why but it's not surprising.
Why were you part of this team anyway? I mean, what made you a Tory?
Well, I got involved in student politics. I was 19 and involved in National Union students. West Streeton was the NUS president, and Bell Ribero-Addy was the MP for Streatham. One of my good friends. They were all part of that set. And I remember going to some of the student functions, and I'd hear the activists speak, and they would say things like, you can kiss the Canary Wharf dream goodbye. I mean, I never went to work in Canary Wharf anyway, but this idea that I didn't have agency over my own destiny was something that was a challenge for me. And then I kind of looked at some of the things we were doing, and I thought to myself, I didn't really want to be outside with a placard. I actually wanted to sit at the table, and I just didn't like the idea of different groups not feeling that they had a political choice, that you always had to vote a particular way.
So do you think if you'd have been a student during the new Labour government of Tony Blair, you might have ended up being a Labour activist? Because they were in power.
No,
they were the aspirational ones.
No, but we were in opposition when I joined the Tory party.
Which was when?
I think it's 2009, 8, 9.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was the fag end of the Labour government, though, wasn't it? It was sort of.
Yeah.
And everyone thought they were probably on their way out.
I mean, as a 19-year-old, that wasn't the first thing I was reflecting on, to be honest. But it was the idea that actually, hey, there's a party that looks more like you, but perhaps doesn't necessarily sound like you. I grew up in church, you know, and very social conservative values is all the things I grew up with. But then there's a party that didn't look like you, but perhaps in some respects sounds like you, but there are also things you don't like in there. And for me, the challenge of trying to craft out a new way of doing politics, or at least engaging with different groups, was something I thought that was interesting. I mean, the reality is, if I didn't join them, I probably wouldn't have ended up in Downing Street, because I took a path that was less travelled. And as I said earlier, as a result, when an opportunity came up, there was only one or two people that could do a specific job, and then you end up being the most senior black advisor in government.
I mean, you say you had social conservative values, and I've read you saying that before. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, values like family. I'm very passionate about the role of families in communities. Values like, at the time, being very firm on how you respond to things like respect and crime, etc. Values like trying to recognize the role of the state versus the role of the individual and communities. I don't think that the state has the answer to all of our social problems. It is an enabler, a convener, the biggest spender, yes, and will always be so, but we are not going to fix most of our social challenges by just assuming that some politicians might end up doing the right thing for 5 years or what have you.
A lot of people, when you hear social conservative, a lot of people think gay rights. Where are you on gay rights and gay marriage and all that kind of stuff?
I'm very much you're
pro-gay rights.
Yeah, it's not what people do in their lives is absolutely none of anybody's business, unless it brings harm to somebody else.
Or abortion is the other one that people often think about when they talk about social conservatism. What are your views on that?
I think women's bodies are women's bodies.
Right. So it's interesting that you use that phrase, because social conservative often tends to go with those issues rather than the issues that you've highlighted when I asked you about it.
And this is why, even as a 19-year-old, I felt like there was a really interesting opportunity to try and create an alternative to what a lot of people assumed has to be the case for a black guy from a working class background. You just always have to vote Labour, or you always have to be part of that group. And if you're not part of that group, there's something wrong with you. But actually, we need to get to a point where everybody feels that they have a choice.
And do you still feel that now, as we look at this government? And again, a lot of people would say this is the fag end of a Conservative government. The assumption is that they're going to lose the next election. They're way behind in the polls. We've had umpteen Home Secretaries, Foreign Secretaries and Prime Ministers. Do you still feel that this is a gang you want to be part of? Is your politics really about sort of grasping the moment and the opportunity and being aspirational and taking power, or is it a little bit tribal? In other words, could you be Labour now as they look likely to go into government?
Yeah, I mean, I am
or is it just once you've picked your team, you have to stick with it?
I mean, you don't have to stick with it, but if you move teams because of the way that the wind is blowing, or the winds have changed, to use the phrase, then you run the risk of having to always do that every 10, 15 years. And so actually,
is that a bad thing? If you move with public opinion?
If you're engaged in politics directly, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a decision that you have to be very wise about making. And I know people have done it already, and there'll be more people doing it.
Are you a proud Conservative now?
I am a proud Brit, and
So that's a no then.
I am involved in politics because I want to make a difference or an impact. Not necessarily, and the team that I've chosen to be a part of, which made sense for me, and is the Conservative Party. But it doesn't mean I agree with everything that a prime minister or an administration is fighting for. And actually, I've been very explicit about, things I'm not necessarily a fan of. I'm just myself, and it's my path. It's not necessarily the path that everybody might want to take, but it's the path that made sense for me. I think there's definitely plenty more that I would love to do and I hope to do, but at the end of the day, I was involved in the largest operation since the Second World War, which was a vaccine deployment, and which was a huge privilege. But had it not been for the choices I made early on in my life, then I wouldn't have probably had the opportunity to do that. And so there are some things I'm proud of, but certainly there was a lot more that I would hope that I could achieve.
And still do? Or do you think it's over, effectively?
No, I've probably, in a weird way, just getting started.
Because obviously you wanted to be Mayor of London, or you wanted to be the candidate.
Want to be Mayor of London.
Still want to be?
Yes.
How do you think that could happen?
Well, I'll need to be the Conservative candidate at some point. Obviously not next year.
Yeah, not next year. I mean, will you support this Conservative candidate?
I know Susan Hall very well. And
because she's had some very controversial views as well in terms of sort of culture war, that stuff that you would oppose. I mean,
the Tory party is a broad church, as is the Labour movement.
Yeah.
It's a broad church. As I say, there are people who maybe...
Are your values closer to hers, or somebody else's?
It depends on the subject.
Yeah.
If you were to talk about maybe policing, for example, probably I think we're quite well aligned in terms of the direction of travel that we think things need to go down. In other respects, probably not so much. But that's okay. That's politics, no?
Will you vote for her?
I live in Hertfordshire, so...
Would you vote for her?
Yeah, if I was in London, yeah.
Just because she's a Conservative?
Because I know her, and because I think our priorities are quite aligned. In terms of, as I say, policing, in terms of, obviously, her position on ULEZ, the expansion, we are aligned on. So on the big subjects, there is some alignment, yes.
So how do you think we could get more outsiders into public life and politics?
Yeah, it's important, because I think when people say, "Oh, Sam, you're the only black advisor in Downing Street, most senior in Whitehall," that's a big deal. I say to them, well, that's a problem more than it is a big deal, because when you don't have diversity of thought, then the outcome is what we've experienced over the last X amount of years, right? And
that's something that's, again, been flushed out in the COVID inquiry, where people are now admitting that there was a lack of diversity of thought.
Yeah, in every respect. And there needed to be way more women in behind the corridors of power than were there. And those women the ones that were there needed to be heard a lot more than they were, to be completely blunt. And so the ways you can do it is you have to be very critical about how people were selected. You asked me earlier about how I ended up in a place like Downing Street. It's not a job you can apply for. And so the question is that okay? Is it okay that you have, 40 odd folks who people may never have heard of besides politicos basically running the country, and a lot of them, the majority of them, are extremely privileged and part of, certain sets.
And just appointed on a whim.
On a whim. And that's probably not okay. In fact, it isn't. And so we need to be more critical about asking how people end up in those positions, and also people who have ended up in those spaces need to be better at telling people how and why and opening those doors so that others can walk through as well.
But I mean, the truth is, at the moment, regardless of your political party, you get close to power by getting close to a politician.
Not only that, there are other routes. I mean, you can be, if you are a thought leader in your space, and if the right people have exposure to your work, then sometimes you are invited in. But then again, you need to have the right people. So, one of the things I did in Downing Street was, I was proactive in seeking out experts and bringing them into the tent, even folks who didn't, vote Conservative or might never ever consider doing that. And when I left, I made sure that some of the people that would have taken some of my portfolio had the same mentality. And so that work is ongoing, but more of it needs to happen in terms of public appointments, how you get really senior, interesting people in the positions where they can make an impact. That's a big deal, because right now, public appointments are essentially jobs for the boys. And so when I was there, I tried to do my best to make sure that changed.
But you had a small unit in Downing Street waging a war on public appointments, didn't you?
Yeah, which wasn't helpful.
Blocking appointments, and it was Dougie Smith and his cohort who were basically sort of out there.
You've read Nadine's book.
Well, actually, Nadine Dorries is the first person to actually name him, isn't it? But I mean, it was widely known that he was sort of waging the culture war when it came to public appointments.
Yeah, big challenges around public appointments. I think under David Cameron, there was a genuine push to try and do things differently. They didn't obviously finish the job. And then what you've had since David Cameron and Theresa May, to an extent, to be fair, is a regression, both under Boris and now under Rishi. It's a very cliquey affair, and it's not the way I think the government should function when it comes to giving jobs to experts.
How could you change it?
More transparency. But
because there is a process. They would say, well, hang on, no public appointments. You apply for the job, you put in your application and your CV, and you're interviewed by some civil servants and the chairman of whatever body that I've been through this. I mean, it's a bizarre Byzantine process. But they'll say there is a process.
Yeah. Well, some jobs are a bit more, I guess, competitively open. But the ones that matter are direct appointments. So there are direct appointments by a Secretary of State. They may arrive with 2 or 3 candidates, but the Secretary of State will pick who they want, or their direct appointments by the Prime Minister, or by default their special advisors.
But do you think people in power ever really want to open up these things, because it takes away their own power to influence who they to get the people they want?
I mean, our democracy is.
Labour could commit to all of this.
I mean, they
won't, because they'll go, well, hang on, because we'd quite like to control.
And they'll do they'll do exactly the same thing, very likely, which they are doing with their candidate selections in many seats as well. It's just that the reason why our politics is broken is because it's by its very nature it's cyclical, which means that folks who are in power want to stay in power and will do everything they possibly can to do so. And those who are not in power obviously don't have the power, so their challenge.
They can't change anything.
Yeah, exactly. And as
soon as they get close to power, then they don't want to change.
Yeah,
anything.
I mean, some of the ways you can do it, ultimately you need good people in good places, people with the right motives, but also, and sometimes people, well, all the time, I would argue, outsiders who look at things differently and who are prepared to do things differently. But also, you need to make sure that often decisions are maybe 1 or 2 steps removed, and so there is a degree of integrity around the process, and so until a prime minister is willing to say, look, I'm going to take off, my hands from, I don't know who the next chair of the BBC is going to be or whatever, you're always going to have this challenge.
The big controversy in your area when you were there was obviously the publication of what became known as the Race Report, which was this inquiry chaired by Tony Sewell, the academic. And that was controversial because it seemed to dismiss institutional racism as a thing. Now, in your book, you said you didn't think Tony Sewell should be in charge of that inquiry. But I wasn't clear whether that was because you didn't think he was, he had the wrong views, or because his views were known.
I think the main reason at the time was, I was partly responsible for helping to put the commission together once the PM had agreed to do it. And I felt like we needed to have a chair that people would trust was relatively objective.
Because this was a commission set up after George Floyd.
Yeah.
What was it supposed to be doing?
It was supposed to deal with some of the big questions where perhaps there was a lot of strength of feeling about the positions people were taking, but not necessarily rooted in, I guess, some form of evidence that was up to date. And
so it wasn't ever supposed to examine whether racism exists or not. Yeah, that's what it ended up getting its headlines for.
Racism was of course, part of the subject matter, an important part of it, but it wasn't the only thing. It was looking at race and racism, but also inequalities. Like, what is the current situation? Because not everybody, a lot of people are saying things hadn't changed since Macpherson's report, and so, but is that the case? And so it was supposed to take an objective view of things.
What do you think went wrong with it?
Well, again, if you're going to have a commission that is hoping to answer these questions objectively, then I think, in my opinion, and at the time, was you needed to have someone that people could argue hadn't already prejudged the outcome. Firstly,
which Tony Sewell had.
Because of some of the things that he had written in the past, there was an unreasonable assumption that perhaps he could have. I'm sure he would argue that he didn't, but that the perception was, for me, significant enough. And then the second thing was, well, we wanted to find a way to bring people together. Now, historically, when you had race reports similar, Scarman, McPherson, etc., you're looking for a high court judge or what have you, who some people might not like. But this was like 2021 or whatever it was, 2020. And in my opinion, actually, there was no reason why you couldn't find a black or an Asian person who could do something like this. And so,
who could be more unifying?
Yeah. So my first choice was Citra McDonald. I also looked at like Sharon White. And so my advice was,
and they said no.
Well, there were three of us involved in making that decision, and so my vote counted for one, and the other two wanted Tony, so they got Tony.
Who were the other two then?
I mean, that's for. I've never mentioned them in public because that's for them to talk about. I can only talk about myself. What I would say is that so
you were just outvoted.
Outvoted, but also I think that, on reflection, I worked for the Prime Minister, and I should have been a bit more vocal to him about the risks attached to not going down the route that I thought was
And was
wise.
The Prime Minister one of those people
No.
who decided?
No.
And do you think that commission was broad-based enough as well, or was it packed with?
I think there were
opinionated.
If you look at the
right-wing
composition of the commission, then I would say it would be easy for you to look at
had a GB News presenter on it.
It'd be easy for you to see the flavors of the three of us that were part of the decision-making process, because there were guys like former chair or current chair of the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales, a space scientist, folks that were probably more aligned with my position on what a commission could look like. But having said that, you want a variety of opinions, don't you? So you don't just want to have folks who are going to look at it with fresh eyes, not chair aside. You also want people who might just so happen to be a GB News presenter to make sure that those debates are robust.
So when that report landed in the press, and they didn't release the report, they released a summary of the report, and came out and did interviews on it, were you horrified?
Yeah, because if I was still in charge, that wouldn't have happened. And so,
because the headline was basically "The government denies racism exists anymore."
Yeah, and that wasn't the exam question, right? And it distracted from some of the really interesting things that were in the report. Having said that, if I was the advisor responsible for basically taking it home, there were things that I certainly would have done differently. I would have published the whole report at once, and or published specific areas, because it was very evident to me when I read it that some parts were just underbaked. I wouldn't have briefed something and then not allow people to read the full report before sending people out like lambs to the slaughter to defend a document that nobody had read.
And was that
was just
part of the culture war, do you think, that they wanted whoever was in charge of this, and the assumption is that it was Munira Mirza in the press, was that they wanted the headlines to be
no
racism isn't a problem anymore?
No. In all humility, I think that and even the folks who are unhappy about me leaving would probably admit that the big issue was that I was no longer involved. There was no way that something like that, which was a shocking piece of choreography, would have happened if I was still involved in that report. When the reports are published, essentially part of the process is a minister or number 10 will have at least a few hours, maybe in a few days, to look at it so that they can challenge and say, well, okay, this is accurate, or we don't agree with this. And then it's for whoever the chair or the commissioners are to say, well, okay, we'll take on your feedback, fair point, you've presented more evidence, or we're not going to accept your points because it's our report, fine. But a lot of the critical thinking that leads up to a report being published, which avoids things like what happened, clearly didn't happen in the way that they needed to happen.
But I'm not clear whether you think it was just a screw up or whether it was
deliberate.
No,
it was, in my opinion, I think it's a screw up.
Do you think you made any mistakes on it? Or
there is a lot of regret, because a lot of the commissioners who are very good people, who are not culture warriors and who genuinely wanted to do something that was for the benefit of the public, found themselves caught up in a moment that was none of their own doing.
That they weren't in control of.
Yeah, many of the commissioners hadn't even read the
I've
whole
spoken to somebody who said
report.
they basically seem to be being told what to conclude.
So I owed them a duty of care, and in me stepping aside for my own reasons, I kind of left them, and that wasn't right.
You've also talked in the book about the pressures you were under in retrospect, and how they contributed to your decisions to leave ultimately. Do you think these are things that can be better handled in high-powered jobs like that, or is it just it's a tough old world out there? You got to learn to live with it.
Yeah, I mean, working in a place like Downing Street is an intense job, right? Every day something is happening. Somebody's always doing something stupid, or a journalist has found out that something is going to happen, or whatever. It's a very active role, and so the best thing you can do is come in as prepared as possible to deliver on whatever your agenda is. But aside from that, there is the day-to-day politics. And because I was, in many ways, I was an outsider, perhaps I never had some of the advanced knowledge of some of the things I was going to face, but also the social networks that maybe, definitely some of my other colleagues would have had, because essentially a bunch of mates came in to run the country. And so I think that was difficult. Having said that, and one of the reasons why when I left, I wanted to write this book, I think that actually the way the world needs to evolve, you need more people who are slightly different in those positions. So there must be a blueprint to allow them to be able to thrive and function. Some of that is around institutions and making sure that they have environments that are conducive for people who are from different backgrounds. But a lot of that is also around how you can give people the tools that they need to be able to function themselves.
And so you still, is your big ambition still to be Mayor of London, personally?
It is ambition. I don't know if that's the big ambition, but yeah.
What's the big ambition?
I don't need a position. I don't need a position to fulfill my ultimate ambition, which is to open doors into the corridors of power for people who have the talent and the know-how and the experience to make an impact. That's what I've been doing since even before I joined the Tory party.
And is that something you can do now that you're no longer in Downing Street?
It's something.
You're back outside effectively. Can you help kick in doors from the outside?
It is probably my main skill set. So it hasn't stopped.
How do you do it?
Knowing the right people, making the right connections, giving people the right information, preparing people. It is my science. And so just because I've left Downing Street, it doesn't mean that work has stopped.
And do you? I mean, because again, the way you're talking about how people navigate this, it's still sort of informal, isn't it? It's about networks. It's meeting the right people. It's that. Are you confident that you can actually, that the system can be changed to actually so that people who don't know anybody, and don't know you or somebody else who they can approach, can actually get involved in public life?
I think people can get involved who don't know individuals who are in positions of influence or power. But in terms of change in institutions, change is never an event, it's a process, and it's very difficult. But having said that, there will be ways for us to navigate systems to get more people in the right positions and hopefully making better choices as a result. So I'm less focused on whether or not an institution will change the way that we'd hope for them to. I'm more interested in saying, well, how can we make sure more people know how to navigate, what is a very imperfect way of governing or leading.
And if you could change the world in any way, how would you change it?
I suppose in this current moment, I would ensure there was lasting peace in the Middle East. And if we weren't in this current moment, I think my focus would be on making sure everybody in this country is able to have a home, a good home viewed as a right and not a privilege. You
don't mean giving everyone a home?
No, not necessarily giving, but building more homes, including social homes, holding more people locally to account. For example, in London, objectively, 52,000 homes a year need to be built. That number is due to rise to close to 100,000, and we're not building nearly anywhere close to that. And there are big structural challenges why we're not building the homes we need. And so that would be the one thing I would change if I could change the world.
Samuel Kasumu, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.